greatly honored and very humbled to have this rare opportunity to share my still evolving ideas with this distinguished group. Instead of following prepared text, I followed some of the discussions earlier by discussing with friends and colleagues. I will share my idea about spiritual humanism in this very limited period of time, maybe 30 minutes or 25 minutes, and simply
up to 6. Up to 6.
Simply to provoke some ideas and discussions. So this is simply intended to serve as a prelude to learning. I understand that especially from the Chinese perspective, for the last 150 years, the world has been very much dominated by a very powerful mode of thinking. We characterized it earlier as westernization, modernization, then more recently as globalization, which is of course totally familiar. But I subscribe to Peter Berger's comparative sociological observation that unlike economic globalization, cultural globalization, far from being a process of homogenization, is noted for its cultural diversity. His book called Many Globalizations, Diversity in the Contemporary World. With this increasing diversification of the world, in the year 2000, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences published a special issue on multiple modernities. The assumption there are two, since I was deeply involved in that project. One is the continuous presence of tradition in modernity. It's totally wrong to understand modernity in terms of a homogenizing process, especially from the cultural point of view. French modernity with the French past, English modernity with the English past. We were very strongly moved by the argument that American modernity is not simply an extension of the European forms of modernity. It's unique. They are rapturous. The other assumption is that the modernizing process can assume different cultural forms. We know for sure, empirically, that outside of the modern West, the emergence of East Asia, with Japan, with South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, China, many forms of modernity emerge with cultural differences. So the continuous presence of the tradition in modernity and the modernizing process can assume different cultural forms, provoked us into thinking that the most powerful ideology perhaps in human history, the Enlightenment project, which continued for 150 or more years, has certainly developed, I will argue, even from the Chinese point of view, universal and universalizable core values, such as freedom, rationality, due process of law, human rights, dignity of the individual. These are universalizable universal values. And yet, I'm also critically aware of the fact for the last 50 years at least, some of the most brilliant minds in the West have been outspoken critiques of the Enlightenment project, even broadly defined. This involved people in ecological thinking, feminists, religious pluralists, cultural diversity, and more recently, people call themselves communitarianists. It is in this particular context, I think China is very much behind in thinking about the world in pluralistic terms, even though China itself is totally committed to cultural diversity, because China is still very much overwhelmed by the Enlightenment mentality of progressivism, of materialism, of now market-oriented economy, and not to mention the form of scientism. And yet, China too is moving towards a more comprehensive, complicated, if not integrated, world of cultural diversity. In this particular context, there's a strong feeling that not convergence in economic sense, but shareable values the values that can help the human community to move ahead will have to be not just imagined, but also practiced and also realized as the major project of the philosophical enterprise. I understand in this meeting, fundamental questions about a new epistemology, a new kind of hermeneutics, and a new kind of praxis are needed for us to think philosophically in the 21st century. In this last August, when I was in the World Congress of Philosophy, I made an argument to persuade FISP, Federation of International Philosophical Societies, to host the 2013 Congress in China. First of all, in the year 2013, for the first time, the Chinese leadership, both political, intellectual, recognized that economic development is only part of the story. So any form of development, if it is to be sustainable, will have to include political, social, cultural, and of course, ecological. So there's a new vision about development. When you have this comprehensive vision about development, the fundamental philosophical question about the meaning of being human, learning to be human. What is the significance of our being here? And what is the form of life that will be sustainable for years to come? These fundamental philosophical questions have been raised in China. Therefore, even though FISP or International Congress may not need China, but China is desperately in need of the presence of philosophical reflections. So to have a meeting of this kind in China is very important for China's self-understanding and self-reflexivity. But I also observed that philosophy as an enterprise, especially for the last 50 or so years, under the tremendous influence of the analytical philosophy in the West, has been so professionalized, very much focused on the purity of method, ordinary logic, epistemology, ontology, philosophy of mind, ordinary language, and become so much a particular mode of human understanding, which makes it somewhat incommunicable to a larger humanistic enterprise. In other words, philosophers have become so professionalized, so much an experts, they do not, on the surface, communicate with the people in social sciences, in the humanities, and other disciplines. So that there's a desperate need for philosophy to move beyond simply the cocoons of professionalism and to involve philosophers as public intellectuals. We have an outstanding Professor Baltimore here as a public intellectual engaged in much broader issues. Thirdly, the time is right for philosophy to be truly global. Truly global in the sense that certainly philosophy, the sunrise stage is in essence in the West, but we hope that the philosopher's sun will not simply set again in Athens in the West. Hopefully will set in a much broader horizon in India and China, Latin American countries, Africa and other places. Now this actually forces us to think, what is the first philosophy? For years and years we just take it for granted, the real contemplative mode of life, therefore metaphysics, ontology, and a philosophical reflection based upon rigorous logic. These are the most important domains of philosophy. Ethics sometimes relegated not to the background, but ethics is considered important in practice, but not necessarily the most important feature of defining the enterprise of philosophy. But I feel that ethics, in my view, is the first philosophy. In a sense, it deals with the process of learning to be human. And the Enlightenment mentality, which shaped the modern, not just the modern West, the modern world for so long, has been very much focused on a particular mode of learning to be human. The core values that are outlined are freedom, justice, human rights, due process of law, dignity of the individual. If we put all of that together, they can give us a very good reading of what now I can characterize it as the paradigmatic example of an economic person, an economic man, a person, a rational animal, who in a relatively free market adjudicated by law will be able to maximize his profit. And this idea, which now we realize is very anthropocentric, very much focused on instrumental rationality. It's a Faustian drive to understand, to know, but also to conquer and to subdue. And it's also very much oriented toward the experience of a particular region in human history and a particular tradition. Is it possible for us to broaden that scope to include many other important human experiences and cultural values, especially core values, so we begin to rethink the universal values that define the 21st century. For example, I think in the West, recently in America in particular, the importance of justice and how we understand justice in addition to simply the importance of freedom. And of course, the question of equality. To me, for your consideration, is the category of compassion, sympathy, and empathy. I did have a great opportunity to share these ideas with quite a few field scholars, including Professor Gadamer. And from his point of view, the category empathy or sympathy and sympathy, empathy, compassion is not philosophically particularly sound. You have to develop religious sentiments. We need to develop a humanism which is reverential to major ethical religious traditions all over the world. We need to develop a particular form of humanism that is not just ecumenical in a religious sense, but is ecumenical in a human sense. In other words, the idea of human flourishing and related to the question of self-cultivation becomes the most important feature of philosophical reflection. In other words, the question of what is human and the process of learning to be human now define the most important feature of philosophical reflection. And philosophy in this sense can never become totally elitist. It is not the discipline of a small minority. It is the self-reflexive enterprise of virtually every human being anywhere in the world. In other words, the idea of learning to be human is predicated on the importance of self-reflection, of self-knowledge. In this sense, self-cultivation, in the great learning, in the Analects, it says, from the emperor to the commoner, self-cultivation ought to serve as the root. The idea of self-cultivation then becomes the important feature of philosophy. In other words, praxis, embodied knowledge. We think not only with our brain, with our mind, but also with our body. When engaged in our thinking, not just in the Marxist sense of trying to change the world, but in the classical Greek, Confucian, all forms of spiritual traditions, of a kind of spiritual exercise in understanding our world. In other words, reflection itself is a transformative act. It is not simply a way of understanding something out there. I don't know whether I'm totally wrong or not. That we see, in addition to a linguistic and epistemological term, there's a kind of ethical spiritual term in the philosophical enterprise. I have a few examples. We all know Hardell's work on philosophy as a way of life, spiritual exercises from Socrates to Michel Foucault, as being a very important defining characteristics of modern philosophical thinking. Henry Putnam, Carly, to the end of his life, up to the end of his career as a professor, decided to talk about 4 Jewish thinkers, even though he himself is very much a mathematical logician. He wanted to deal with Maimonides, with Rosenzweig, with Martin Buber, and with Levinas. And we know recently, in the last few years, Charles Taylor's major contribution to move beyond the secular age. The secular age is to say the world has to be re-sacralized. The world has to be able to realize the great spiritual heritages of humanity. Catholicism becomes an important reference for people. But this is also true with even Michel Foucault and Derrida. And Derrida, Michel Foucault's idea of the care for the self, and Derrida ran very deeply concerned about the question of forgiveness, from especially the Judaic point of view. So there's a rich Hindu tradition, Chinese tradition, many other traditions. The dichotomy between faith and reason, between the Greek and the Judaic, which define the complexity of the modern heritage, will have to be overcome. We need to think right now, in addition to civilizational dialogue, the dialogue between faith and rationality, faith and reason. And in this connection, then all the other spiritual traditions, the Buddhist tradition, the Confucian tradition, Taoist tradition, Christian, Judaic, all these other traditions, Islamic in particular, give us rich, not only symbolic resources, but actual practical resources for us to think about hermeneutics in relationship to spiritual exercise and practices on the one hand, and think about the development of a new epistemology, not only based upon simply contemplative thinking, but based upon embodied knowledge. I remember one Japanese scholar for many years has been involved in this particular discussion. How can we develop not just a theory, but a philosophy that praxis is not only an application of our knowledge of philosophical reflection. Praxis helps us to understand how we think, how we reflect upon the reality of life. And the levels of praxis, in fact, determine the level of philosophical sophistication. We know the rich literature in all the spiritual disciplines. So in this connection, it is not simply the merging of religion and philosophy. It is the philosophical self-reflection, recognizing the major challenge of the world today, and beginning to reflect upon the philosophical enterprises, as what Heidegger even pointed out, that the question of what is man is just as important in a way should consider even prior to the question of what can we know, what ought we do, and what can we hope. And in this particular context, the kind of spiritual humanism I have in mind is simply this. We can use one example, the example of Confucianism as a way of understanding this. I will end with a very brief comment. In this particular tradition, through many forms of intercivilizational dialogue, we have realized that the humanistic vision here understood presupposes that the ultimate meaning of life is realizable and ought to be realized in ordinary human existence. The life world in which we eat, drink, walk, rest, sleep, and dream on our own, and talk, discuss, debate, argue, and converse with others, is not merely secular, profane, mundane, and vulgar, but also creative, dynamic, vital, noble. Xunzi, for example, a Confucian thinker, argues that heaven engenders and humans complete. Implicit in this proclamation is that through human effort, heaven's creative vitality would be brought to fruition on earth. Indeed, as participants of the cosmic transformation and even co-creator of this evolutionary process, we're capable of and indeed obligated to realize heaven's creativity on earth. The classical manifestation of this is the mutual responsiveness of the human world here and now and the way of heaven. And there's a statement that only those who are most sincere, absolutely sincere, true, real, and authentic can fully realize their own nature, human nature. If they can fully realize their own nature, they can fully realize human nature. If they can fully realize human nature, they can realize the nature of things. If they can fully realize the nature of things, they can take part in the transforming and nourishing process of heaven and earth. They can then form a trinity with heaven and earth. By implication, forming one body with heaven and earth and a myriad things through experiential self-understanding and human connectedness, not only with other human beings, with much larger world beyond. Our human responsibility is not just simply sociological. It is laden with cosmological implication as well. And we know that this idea of forming one body with heaven and earth and many things involves 4 dimensions of the human condition. One is the self, and then community, nature, and heaven. How the self can integrate the body, mind, and soul and spirit. How there's a fruitful interaction between the self and others, including radical others. Not just the family, but community and beyond, even beyond the anthropological world. How can there be a sustainable, harmonious relationship between the human species and nature? Nature is no longer recognized as not the radical otherness or the collection of objects, but as a communion of subjects. And how there is a mutuality or mutual responsiveness between the human heart and mind and the will of heaven. In this sense, then, Thomas Berry's felicitous expression, nature is not a collection of objects, but a communion of subject, and one of the most inspiring ecological wisdom is embodied in the African proverb that earth is not a precious gift from our ancestors, but a resource entrusted to us by numerous generations in the future. This enjoins us to probe the depth of the ecological meanings of the African idea of Ubuntu. I am because you are. The biblical idea of love and charity. I think I take the notion that love, hope, and faith and love is the most important. And of course, the Confucian idea of humanity. And humanity is understood as sympathy and compassion. We do know that there's the gap between the surplus of the human affectivity and deficit of human cognition. And yet, if the human cognition is now cultivated to appreciate the comprehensive and overflowing of human emotionality, and in so doing, try to develop a world in which the 2 golden rules, one is do not do to others what you would not want others to do to you, the principle of reciprocity. And then the other one is to do to others in such a way you enlarge yourself, you help others to enlarge themselves, you establish yourself, a sense of recognition of the radical otherness, respect for the other, therefore the possibility of mutual reference, mutual learning, and celebration of difference. And yet, with the celebration of difference, there's strong commitment to a human transformation which requires the care for the earth. No religion can afford to argue that the kingdom of God yet to come is so great, the world which is, after all, the world of Caesars. Let it pollute. No one can argue that the pure land, that the other shore is superior to the red dust, which is the secular world here now. Then the reconfiguration of not only the earth, but also the human community, not as simply secular, but profoundly sacred. And of course, the human body, which is absolutely critical for self-reflexivity. This may help us to try to rethink about epistemology, method of philosophical understanding, rethink the question about hermeneutics, especially the continuous relevance of the past and present, and also to rethink why praxis is theoretically sophisticated and important. It's not simply the application of our philosophical insight. Thank you. And the underlying question is actually raised by UNESCO, especially Hans Stoddard. In the past, humanism was often nationally and regionally oriented. The new humanism must be truly global, contributing to harmonious relationships between the different regions of the world today. Diversity, the basis of dialogue, is at heart of a new humanism, which should not be understood as an intellectual, ethical, or cultural modeling. This is why we need to explore the potential of Confucianism in the interest of the present and the coming generations. Humanism in the 21st century can be envisioned as one immense civilizational river fed by an incalculable number of cultural tributes. Of course, this may sound like the official statement, but my own work is very much rooted in the first question about spiritual heritage. The problematique we face now is what a number of people call the viability of human species. It's a question of the earth. So for the first time in human history, we have a comprehensive, holistic view of the great planet. Every aspect of it, the mineral, water, soil, air, and everything. This is not possible for Hegel, Kant, or any great minds in the past. With this, every human being is capable of a global vision, even children. So that's our heritage, new heritage. Now, I do believe going back is no way. Going back without reflection. We move ahead with a deep understanding of the human spiritual heritage as one of the ways of redefining the meaning of being human. Now in the West, there's no question about this major effort on the part of some of the most brilliant minds to go back to Catholicism, to go back to Judaism, to go back to all kinds of traditions. This going back is a reflection on the contemporary problematique. The going back is like T.S. Eliot's notion about tradition and individual talent. And that individual talent restructures the past to be able to go back. In other words, like the classical Confucian idea, I'm not a creator, I'm a transmitter. Because to be a transmitter is much more difficult than to be a creator, because you are spiritually, intellectually, ethically responsible for your spiritual heritage as well. We're not just inventing with a view off toward the path, toward the future with any kind of, with no notion about the past. So we're in a situation where the various kinds of dichotomous mode of thinking, like the socialist, capitalist, modern, traditional, religious, secular, progressive, regressive, liberal, conservative, democratic, authoritarian, and so forth, all appear to be extremely simplistic. And we need to have a complex way. And that complex way is very much the whole question about representing the XUH civilization. That's why I think I go along with quite a number of scholars, Raimondo Panica and your cousins and so forth, about the new XUH. We're in a new XUH, period. And with that in mind, the spiritual heritage that inform our way of doing things allow us not to make a dichotomous choice between the past and the present, between reason and rationality on the one hand and spirituality on the other, or the secularity and the sacredness. So I think for the first time we move beyond Weber's definition of modernity as rationalization or as secularization. So in this sense, then the first question, the kind of spiritual heritages of Buddhism, of Taoism, of Christianity, all these now become meaningful for our current situation of understanding ourselves, but in a highly diversified situation. So I do believe in the 21st century and beyond, these great XUH civilizations, all of them will flourish. Catholicism will flourish. And Eastern Orthodox, various kinds of Protestantism, Judaism, Islam, all kinds of Sufism, and Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, they will flourish. but all in totally new light. The term spiritual humanism actually was coined by the great Indian philosopher Balasubramanian in a conversation on Indian and Chinese philosophical reflections on knowledge, wisdom, and spirituality. He said the more he encountered this tradition, the more he believed it's not humanism as a secular form of human interaction, but it's spiritual humanism, because the reverential towards virtually all the major religious traditions, and yet committed ourselves to the world from within. So what we're talking about is the emergence of a kind of immanent transcendence. It's the acceptance of the world here and now, the blue planet, the sacred, the communities of various kinds. Of course, many of them are corrupt, many states are not functioning, but the order, the complexity of the order is something that we have to work with. This is not our point of departure. But at the same time, when we do this, we have a vision which may be informed by the past, but it's dictated by the crisis of the present and with aspiration of the future. Now, with this particular vision, we need to have virtually all major spiritual traditions or religious traditions to go beyond the specific sacred language of each one of them. So my sense is that in addition to the specific religious languages, symbolisms of great ex-age civilizations, we need a new language that is either the common trust or the shared values of the global community. And that global community is informed by more we become critically aware of what we ought to do. Otherwise we would be in trouble, and the kind of irreversibility is upon us. The more we become intellectually clear what we ought to do, the more we feel constrained by various kinds of forces, not only institutional, but also our habits of heart and the different kinds of social order that we cannot do anything about. So we see with clarity that we are down the drain, and the situation becomes worse and worse. And therefore, we see now the emergence in North America as well as in Asia, everywhere. There's a new idea of learning to be human. Now, let me just finish with one concept. This is because I'm working from China. If a cultural identity emerges in China, we hope that identity is open rather than closed. So it's patriotism, but not nationalism. Certainly not chauvinistic nationalism. It is pluralistic. It's respect for the Chinese, all kinds of minorities, Tibetan Buddhists, the Uyghurs, and so forth. And also self-reflexive. To say what we do here in our local community is not only great for us, but it's great for our neighbors, for a much broader view. And unless you have this Kantian notion about universality, you cannot work it. However, you have to focus on the concrete, because I think in the Confucian tradition, philosophy begins with the concrete living person here and now. That's concrete humanity. And therefore, we do it not by constructing actual ideas. We do it by self-reflexivity. As a person, we're always essential relationships. So you have the centeredness, but also relations. So in this sense, it's pragmatic. It's very like Dewey. It's very like, but it's more way beyond what secular humanism and secular pragmatic ideas will be to accommodate. And also, I think historicity is absolutely critical. But we should, and finally, Professor Gianni Martimo's a great problem. I was very fortunate to moderate a discussion between Professor Martimo and Richard Rorty. And on the question of postmodernism. Richard Rorty said, look, 50 years from now, there's only one language that matters. And of course, that was before he visited China. After he visited China, it's maybe two. But anyway, that notion, and also hybridity. No sense of the past, no sense of history. It's hybridity that works. All museums are open without walls and so forth. But Professor Martimo are much closer to his vision. He reconsidered his affiliation or idea with his own past church. But certainly not necessarily the Vatican's version of it. this spiritual heritage. That's very specific. And yet, it's the global significance of local knowledge. It's the global significance that I used the term that I like. It's the global significance of concrete humanity. And that concreteness specifies that we have to deal with the problem at hand. And yet, the way we do it is precisely to consider that as not only socially, culturally, but globally and humanistically and cosmologically significant. So the global significance of local knowledge, that is the basis of this humanistic orientation, which is deeply rooted in spirituality.
Thank you, Professor.